Hello everybody, this is Kate at the Library of Whispers, and today I'm going to read to you Chapter 3 from my ghost story mystery, Hallows House. This is called The Library. Saturday, the 3rd of November. The library was situated on Brewery Lane in the centre of town. Close by was the Merry Monk Inn, which according to Rachel was wholeheartedly approved of by her library colleagues, since many a merry lunchtime could be had in the old beer house. It was Saturday morning, and we were having a quick breakfast at Fogg's Cafe, just around the corner on Grape Street. It was a greasy spoon affair, as my mother would have snobbishly described it, but it was warm and cheerful, and they made wonderful cakes and pastries. Plus, I still hadn't satisfied my cake craving after watching the baking show the other evening. Rachel sat opposite me. She was in deep thought and distracted by an old map of the town on the wall next to our table. I, on the other hand, was tucking into a gloriously sticky Danish pastry. "Rach," I said, pointing to the unspoiled Danish pastry sitting neglected in front of her. "Are you going to eat that?" I noted with some consternation that it had a larger cherry on the top than mine. She ignored my question and instead asked one of her own. "Mum, have you noticed that there are a lot of fogs in this town? The place is full of them." "Fog?" I answered in bewilderment. "You mean like mist?" "No, that's not what I mean," she said. "Fogg with 2 G's, the surname. We're in Fogg's Cafe, and further down the road there's a Fogg and Sons butcher's, and I'm sure we passed a chemist with the name G. Fogg over the door, and look at this town map." She pointed to the bottom of the map on the wall. It said, "Oliver Fogg and Sons, Mapmakers, Monk's Ferry, 1897. I studied the map and shook my head. "I hadn't noticed," I replied, then took another large bite of my pastry. "Also," she continued, "you said the old man with the dog was called Fogg." "Yep," I mumbled, with a full mouth. I'd already filled Rachel in about my chat with Stanley Fogg at the cemetery yesterday. She sat quietly for a moment and then added, "I was thinking about what he told you, about his great-great-grandmother." "What about her?" I said, wiping my mouth with a napkin. "If she was the housekeeper at the old hall, then she must have been the person who found Elizabeth Pike's body. The newspaper report we read indicated that she was the only other person in the house on the night of the murder." "Ah, but don't forget Elizabeth's 2 mysterious guests," I added. She nodded, then reached into her shopping bag and pulled out the old envelope that had escaped yesterday's fire. Taking out the newspaper clippings from the packet, she began scanning one of the reports with her index finger. "There's also mention of some other Foggs here," she said. "It says, Mr. and Mrs. Elijah Fogg provided the food for the engagement ball, and they were landlords at the Merry Monk Inn too." "Interesting," I said, as I licked sticky jam off my fingers. "But I suppose there are lots of family surnames that still linger in all small towns like this. It's not that unusual, is it?" "Maybe not," she said. "I wonder if the family still run the pub." "Seems unlikely after all this time," I said, popping the last bit of pastry into my mouth and licking each of my sticky fingers one by one. Rachel shuffled through the other newspaper clippings. "Do you want me to read another one of these to you before we go into the library?" I nodded for her to go ahead and took a sip of my cappuccino. "OK, this one is about Elizabeth Pike's funeral," she said, as she unfolded a long piece of yellowing newsprint. If that's not too morbid a subject on a Saturday morning, she added. Well, it's all morbid, Rachel, I laughed. And don't let that pastry sit there for too long, I added, pointing to her untouched Danish. I didn't want that large shiny cherry going to waste. She rolled her eyes at me and took a large, deliberate bite out of the pastry. After wiping her mouth and hands on the paper napkin beside her, she smoothed the clipping out onto the table. This is from the Monk's Ferry Journal, she said. It's the Saturday edition from the 4th of November, 1872, and it says, Murder at Monk's Ferry, funeral of Miss Elizabeth Pike. The funeral of Miss Elizabeth Pike, aged 24, who was murdered in her home, the Old Hall, last week, on the evening of the 31st of October, took place on Friday morning, the interment being in the cemetery of All Hallows Church in this town. The Reverend Charles Griffin, vicar of All Hallows, who recently became engaged to be married to the ill-fated lady, took the sombre service. The time of the ceremony was amended to the early morning at the last minute to avoid the expected crowds. However, a large group of spectators from the town did attend, some of whom were seen to be huddled under the cemetery lychgate, seemingly undeterred by the vicious storm that was then passing overhead. The coffin containing the body of Miss Pike had lain in the Monk's Ferry mortuary since the night of the murder, and then handed over to Mr. S. Fogg, undertaker. At this point, Rachel stopped reading and looked up, exclaiming in disbelief, Another Fogg! Mum, these people get around. I nodded and smiled, and she continued. Accordingly, at 9:15 on Friday morning, a mourning coach, driven by 2 white horses with black plumes, and bearing the Pike family crest, arrived at the cemetery. A small number of spectators from the town were reluctantly moved away from the cover of the lychgate to allow the coffin bearers to enter the graveyard. The coffin was followed to the main entrance of the church by the chief mourners, the brothers of the deceased, Mr. Ebenezer Pike, Esquire, and Mr. Joseph Pike, Esquire, Mr. Richard Pike, Esquire, the deceased's uncle, Mr. Josiah Bell, Esquire, former business partner of the deceased's father, Mr. Alpheus Pike, and some members of the Reverend Griffin's family. These persons were followed by various servants of the Old Hall, including Mr. Sylvester Scullion, house steward, Mr. Donald Chaplin, butler, Mrs. Fogg, housekeeper, and various footmen and maids. The Mayor of Monk's Ferry, who had attended Miss Pike's engagement ball with his wife last month, was not in attendance, since Mrs. Bertram had been struck down once again by a sudden mystery illness. As previously reported, the service was conducted by the deceased's former fiancé, the Reverend Charles Griffin, who began by addressing the mourners there in attendance, beseeching them to recognise the special solemnity of the occasion, that death under favoured circumstances was painful, but that the occasion of this death was intensely so. The Reverend gentleman then offered a reading from 1 Corinthians 15, taken from the 19th verse. After this, the Reverend spoke of his own personal sorrow and the moment of sin which had cruelly snatched from his reach and those of the mourners, there present, a future wife, a sister and friend. As the Reverend began to pray for those present to be comforted, a commotion was heard at the back of the church, and an unidentified woman was seen shouting and flaying her arms about in a wild and dramatic manner. 2 policemen from the Monk's Ferry Constabulary, who attended the entrance to the church, were seen to restrain the woman and remove her quickly from the scene. Despite this strange incident, the service was a deeply affecting one, and the spectators outside the church, who were now many in number, despite the heavy rain, were most orderly. Rachel finished reading. The paper is ripped at the bottom, she said, so it ends abruptly. I wonder who the woman was that was flaying her arms about, I said. What on earth do you suppose that was all about? I guess we may never know, she answered, taking another bite of pastry. We finished our coffees and wandered around the corner to the imposing mid-Victorian building which housed the library and archives of Monk's Ferry. A date over the tall doorway, carved into the pale sandstone between two huge pillars, read, Free Library, 1865. Rachel opened one of the heavy outer doors and directed me inside a spacious entrance hall. We walked across the hall's red and green mint-and-tiled floor and paused at the bottom of a grand central staircase with elaborately carved handrails. The archives are up there, on the second floor, she said, pointing up the stairs. This place is gorgeous, I whispered to her, eyeing up all the Victorian grandeur. You don't have to whisper, Mum, she said. But it's a library, I said, in a slightly louder whisper. Yeah, but this is just the entrance. I know, but it's like going into a church, isn't it? I always feel strangely reverential when I enter an old library like this. Because it's a cathedral of books, offered Rachel. Exactly, I said. Rachel smiled and ushered me up the richly carpeted stairs. At the top, we took a turn to the right, where a second flight of stairs led to a set of double doors with long brass handles. The tops of the handles were shaped like dolphins' heads. Look at those! How beautiful, I said, as Rachel pulled open a heavy door and began to motion me inside. Then she hesitated and patted one of the dolphin heads. You know, I'd never noticed them before. You'd never noticed them before, I repeated. Rachel, how long have you been working here? I don't have an eye for detail like you do, she quipped. Even so, how could you miss them? I said. She shrugged and continued into the reading room. This room was just as impressive as the rest of the building, large and square and lined with dark wooden bookcases, full to the brim with old books of various sizes and types. 3 huge floor-to-ceiling sashed windows occupied much of the wall to the left. To keep the light in the room artificially low, they were covered with semi-opaque blinds. It smelled wonderful too, that delightful aroma of vintage books, of almond and vanilla mustiness. I had a candle at home called Old Library, which had a similar smell. Rachel had bought it for me last Christmas, but I have to say, nothing can beat the real thing. In the middle of the room, a few people sat at large oak tables. Some were studying old books, and others read newspapers under little reading lights with brass shades. Rachel pointed to the far end of the room, where I could just make out in the dimness a petite, dark-haired woman standing next to a desk. That's Sue, she said, waving to the woman. Sue waved back and began to approach us. I guessed that she was in her mid to late 40s. She wore her thick black hair in many tiny braids, and she was dressed in a neat plaid skirt and white blouse. As she got closer, I also spotted a little pair of decorative gold-rimmed glasses perched on the end of her nose. Just the kind a librarian might wear, I thought. Hey, Rach, I'm surprised to see you here on your day off, she said. We've come to check something out, said Rachel, smiling, then introducing us. She said, Sue, this is Mum. Mum, this is Sue. She's the boss around here. I said hello and went to shake Sue's hand, realising too late that both of her arms were fully encumbered with books. Let me put these down, she said, placing the books carefully on one of the nearby tables. Then holding out her hand to shake mine, she said, Lovely to meet you. Rachel tells me you've just moved to the area. Have you come about the old documents Rachel showed me yesterday? Yes and no, I said, although it is connected. We're looking for a painting rather than a book. I was told by one of the locals that there's a large one of a young Victorian woman here. Her name was Elizabeth Pike. There should also be one of her father, Alpheus. Apparently they are on display here in the reading room. I told Mum that I didn't recall seeing any paintings like that here, said Rachel. That's true, said Sue. They're no longer here. They were taken down a few years ago to make way for newer works of art. It's a bit before my time. We do have several large paintings of the founder and benefactors of the library down in the stores, though. Perhaps that's what you're looking for. The founder, I said. Yes, Alpheus Pike founded the library in 1865. You might have seen the date carved above the front door as you came in. I think your documents mention his name. Yes, they do, I said. Apparently his sons built our house. Ah, interesting, said Sue. Rachel said you've moved into an old house that needs doing up. Bit more than doing up, Rachel murmured and smiled knowingly at me. Ignoring her sass, I replied, It does need some work, but we'll get there. Sue nodded. I can take you downstairs to see the paintings if you like. I just need a minute to get the keys and the collections register. That would be wonderful, I said. Thank you. The library stores were in the basement of the building. Sue guided us to the back of the reading room, where a small door marked private revealed a set of descending stone steps. According to Sue, this was a quick back way into the basement. We followed her down the many steps into the bowels of the building, then along a long corridor with a heavy wooden door at the end of it. At the top of the door, the words Staff Only appeared, etched into a brass plate in black lettering. I was intrigued. What was in this locked and restricted place, open only to those with the right credentials? Sue drew out a bunch of keys, placed one of them in the lock and turned it. The thick, heavy door had been reinforced, and it took her some effort to open it. We entered a dark, chilly, windowless room. I could hear the hum of an air conditioning unit which presumably kept the temperature low to protect the precious old objects. Sue flicked a switch at the side of the wall, and a couple of fluorescent tube lights buzzed and flickered for a moment before coming on. The light revealed a long room with bare brick walls. Tall metal racks were attached to both sides of the longest walls. They held framed and unframed artworks and paintings of all shapes and sizes, stacked in organised vertical rows. Sue began to cross-check the handwritten shelf labels with a large inventory register. She stopped at one end of the rack and motioned us to join her. Here is Alpheus Pike, she said, handing Rachel the register and noisily pulling it out to the metal rack to its full length. A large gilt-framed oil painting of a distinguished-looking middle-aged Victorian man appeared before us. He was bearded and formally dressed in a dark frock coat and seated beside a polished wooden desk in a dimly lit, wood-panelled room. Next to him stood a large wolfhound that rested its head on his right knee. His left hand affectionately stroked the top of the hound's head. He has kind eyes, mused Rachel. The dog or the man, I quipped. Rachel rolled her eyes at me. Then she took out her phone and asked Sue for permission to take a photograph of the painting. Aiming her phone at the canvas, she suddenly said, Mum, is that our clock? I moved closer to the picture to get a better look. Behind the figure of Alpheus Pike stood a tall grandfather clock, which, as Rachel suggested, looked remarkably like the one currently sitting in our hallway at home. It could be, I said. It's very similar. It's more than similar, it's the same. I'd recognise that monstrosity anywhere, Rachel said. I frowned and turned to Sue. Rachel really dislikes our adopted clock. I see, said Sue with a grin. I wonder if there's anything in the record about it. She took the register from Rachel and scanned the entry with her finger. The date of the painting is July 1868, and Alpheus's dates are recorded here as 1814 to 1868, which suggests it was finished in the year he died. There's no mention who the artist was and nothing about the clock, although the dog's name was Clontarf. Clontarf, I said. That's unusual. Yeah, said Sue, examining the register notes again. It says that the family were originally from Ireland, from a coastal area on the north side of Dublin called Clontarf. That answers that then, said Rachel, taking another shot of the painting. Then she looked at Sue. Do you think the room Alpheus is sitting in is somewhere in the old hall? Maybe, said Sue, although it could have been anywhere really. The offices of Pike and Bell Shipping, perhaps? It says here that they were located a bit further up the river in Myrtleton. What was Pike and Bell Shipping? I asked. Sue looked at the register again. It appears to have been how Alpheus Pike made his fortune. He came across to Monk's Ferry from Ireland in the early 1830s and met Josiah Bell, a local boat builder. The pair went into business constructing large steam-driven vessels from the Isle of Man Steam Packet Company. I suppose they would have called it new money back then. So I'm guessing he went on to use his newfound wealth to buy the old hall, said Rachel, although our newspaper clippings give the impression that the Pikes were one of those ancient families, part of the old nobility. They even had a family crest. Yes, said Sue, but that was probably a made-up or borrowed crest. A 19th century contrivance, to give the impression that the Pike family were just that, part of the landed gentry, even though it wasn't actually true. Curious, I said, peering at the face of Alpheus Pike. I wonder if he's also buried at All Hallows. Have you been to the churchyard? Asked Sue. We were there yesterday, said Rachel. We found Elizabeth Pike's grave. We have the cemetery records here if you're interested, said Sue. I wish we'd known that. It might have saved us the aggravation, I said, turning to Rachel. Rachel winced at the memory of our argument and nodded. Anyway, first things first, said Sue, pushing the rack with Alpheus Pike's picture back into its place and pulling out the rack next to it. Let me show you the painting of Elizabeth Pike. It slid into view, and I gasped in surprise. It's you, I exclaimed, looking at Rachel and then back at the painting. Rachel stared in astonishment at the slender figure. That's crazy, she said. Elizabeth Pike stared solemnly into a large gilt mirror that hung over an ornate marble fireplace. She wore a long-sleeved, silky peacock blue dress, and around her neck was a string of pearls. Sue looked a little dumbfounded too. I haven't looked at this painting in a very long time, she said. But, yes, she does look like you, Rachel. How bizarre. Okay, this is a little creepy, said Rachel, with a nervous laugh. What does she have in her hand? I asked, taking a closer look. Sue took out a magnifying glass from her pocket and placed it close to the canvas. Her left hand is resting on her hip and there's a scarf tied loosely around her wrist, but in her right I think she's clutching some keys. 5 keys, said Rachel slowly, on a brass ring. Are you sure, Rachel? Asked Sue. It's quite difficult to tell. And the scarf is made of silk, continued Rachel, ignoring Sue's question. Then she whispered ominously to me, Mum, that can't be the same scarf, can it? What do you mean? I said. The one they found around her neck. said Rachel, without taking her eyes off Elizabeth Pike. They found around her neck, said Sue, in bewilderment. Rachel stepped back from the picture. It can't be. I'm overthinking this because I'm weirded out right now. Then turning to Sue, she said, she was strangled with a silk scarf. It says so in the newspaper report we have. She was murdered, said Sue. I had no idea. I wonder if the book mentions it. The book? Said Rachel and I in unison. Yes, said Sue. The history of the old hall. It's one of a volume of 4 from a 19th century history of Monk's Ferry. We have it up in collections. I think it was written by one of the local vicars at the time. Not Elizabeth Pike's betrothed, exclaimed Rachel to me. This I need to see. And that ends chapter 3. Next time we'll read chapter 4. Bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.